San Antonio, Texas. Okay, we have a couple already participants online, so we'll go ahead and start our webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, once again, and welcome to today's webinar, Make Your Program Work, the Value of Cultural Adaptations for Latino-Serving Substance Use Treatment Organizations. We're glad to have you with us. Today's session will be led by Dr. Daniel Santisteban. Thank you for joining us. Let's go ahead and get started. To hear today's presentation in Spanish, please go to the Interpretation tab on your Zoom panel and click Spanish. You can also mute the English speaker's voice clicking Mute Original Audio. Para escuchar la presentación de hoy en español, vaya a la pestaña de interpretación en su panel de Zoom y haga clic en Español. También puede silenciar la voz del presentador en inglés haciendo clic en Silenciar audio original. Now we will review a few housekeeping items. Today's event is being recorded and will be made available publicly through our website and other media channels. For today's webinar, all participants will be muted. If you would like to speak or ask a question live, you may raise your hands and you will be given access to unmute your microphone. Please make sure your computer speakers are turned on and up to hear today's presentation. If you are having technical issues, please send a message to the Hispanic Latino Behavioral Health Center of Excellence on the chat box. If you have a question for our presenters, we ask that you use the chat, simply type your question and hit send. We can address questions to the presenter at the appropriate time and during today's presentation or at the conclusion. We will be sharing a copy of today's presentation in a PDF format through the chat box. We will also make a copy of today's presentation available to download it through our website. You can find it under the name of today's event. A recording of today's webinar will be posted in our YouTube channel as well. Okay, please complete the evaluation. The evaluation will help us know more about your opinion and thoughts about this presentation and what other topics and training would you like to see offered. A link of the evaluation will be shared through the chat, and you can also scan the QR code at the end of the presentation to complete it. You will receive a certificate of attendance by email approximately 1 week from today. Please remember to check your junk folder. The mission of the Hispanic Latino Behavioral Health Center of Excellence is to advance and support the sustainability of behavioral health by promoting community-driven, culturally grounded, and person-centered prevention, treatment, multiple pathways of recovery, and recovery support for Hispanic and Latino communities, and strive to accomplish this mission through the development of dissemination of culturally informed, evidence-based behavioral health information, providing training and technical assistance, and supporting the growth and expansion of the behavioral health workforce that serve Latino communities. Learning objectives of today's webinar is to identify whether cultural adaptations to existing evidence-based programs and practices may be beneficial in treating substance use disorders for Latino population. Describe an array of cultural adaptation models, frameworks, and methods. Highlight the benefits of challenges of undertaking cultural adaptations and provide recommendations and resources to culturally adapt and implement an existing EBPP. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Santisteban, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Miami and the Director of Research for Training and Implementation Associates. Dr. Santisteban is a developer of the evidence-based, culturally informed, and flexible treatment for adolescents, and the author of the forthcoming 2025 SIFTA book focus on family treatment for Latino adolescents. He has authored more than 50 scientific publications and has been recognized with multiple awards, honoring his outstanding lifetime contributions by psychology and family therapy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Santisteban. Take it away, Doctor.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone being here and for your strong interest in culturally competent, culturally informed work. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the Center of Excellence for the extraordinary work that you do on all of these types of important missions. So today we're talking about cultural adaptations, and we really need to think about why we're considering this kind of work. It's not easy work, as we'll talk about today. There's a certain level of complexity to it if we want to do it well, but it's so important if we want to provide the very best services, right, for the Hispanic Latino communities that we want to serve. What we know from quite a bit of research is that there is a pretty significant underutilization of mental health services, right, by our Latino populations. And it's important to know that underutilization can mean many things. In the first place, right, we know that many of our families never engage into services, right? They never begin services at all. And we have to think about, if we want to impact that, right, we have to think about why does that happen and where do we impact? Where specifically do we zoom in to impact? And the first question, of course, is whether the service is attractive, right, to families, to youth to begin at all with services, and whether there is potentially distrust of the institution offering the services. If either of those things is true, then folks won't even come in for one session. Some people that begin services might drop out prematurely. And when you look at the research, you have evidence of that as well, right? Folks that will come in for 2, 3 sessions and then stop. And that is a similar but different problem, right? If we want to impact that, we have to wonder what's happening there, right? Is it possible that a strong therapeutic alliance is not being formed? They can't connect to the therapist. They can't understand their values and their plans for treatment. If those are not going well, therapeutic alliance will be weak. It's also possible that the therapeutic approach that we're taking is not compatible, right? When I first started this work at the University of Miami, and we were working with Latino families, many of the treatments were individually focused on the adolescent or the child. And very clearly, the Latino families were telling us, the family needs to be involved. This is not about me dropping off my kids. I need to know what's happening. You need to know our values. And so a lot of folks realized at that moment that only child-focused treatments was not compatible with the familial view and worldview of Latinos. So that's a good example of someone who sought treatment and found a roadblock or a challenge because they did not agree with the values assumptions in the treatment. And so we're going to be talking quite a bit about those kinds of things today. Now, there's a third piece of this that is, even if folks engage into treatment, even if folks stay in treatment, it is possible that outcomes are not going to be as good as they can be, right? They're not optimal outcomes. And that could be happening because the unique situations and stressors that the family is confronting are not being addressed by the therapy. That is, the family stayed through from beginning to end, but somehow the treatment was not designed, right, to address the unique stressors that Latino families may have. And so we're going to be talking about all of these different levels, but I want you to just get a feel for the fact that if we want to really make an impact on one of these, we have to understand what the challenge is and what the possible solutions are. So in effect, cultural norms around mental health, stigma, what is an acceptable form of support, these can all influence whether folks seek and continue in treatment and have good outcomes, right? Today we're talking a little bit more in a way focused on substance use disorders, right? Substance misuse. And these are some of the data from SAMHSA 2023 reports that show some of the patterns, right, of substance use among Hispanics age 12 and older. I tend to take these with a grain of salt to the extent that we can't get married to these numbers of 7.2 and 9.9 for drug use disorder. Why? Because things vary across ages. Things vary across subgroups within the Latino community. Some things are underreported, some things are overreported. But this at least gives us a sense, right, of the severity of the problem and that it's pretty common, right? It is pretty common. And I want you to also understand, and again, the reason that I always put a caveat to this is that this is talking about substance use disorders, right? Diagnosable substance use problems. But we know, right, that many folks have pretty severe substance misuse problems, even if they do not reach a diagnostic criteria. And we must attend to those folks. And when we throw those into this graph, the numbers would shoot up dramatically, yeah? Substance use issues that severely affect kids, families. And by the way, substance use is very unique in that it potentiates, right? It exacerbates other things. If you're working with self-harm, you know that substance use by that person potentiates and increases the likelihood of self-harm. We're talking about depression, substance use potentiates and increases the anxiety, the depression, etc. And so, you know, even non-diagnostic below threshold substance use is really important for us in our treatment efforts. But keep in mind these numbers, and then look at these numbers reported by SAMHSA on whether people perceive a need for substance use treatment, whether they seek substance use treatment, right? And you see that over 93% of folks that have a disorder, right, that can be diagnosed, still do not feel that their issue is sufficiently important, sufficiently severe, right, to seek treatment. And so, you know, we ask the question, why, right? Why is it that, you know, folks will decide that they don't need treatment? And I would argue that it's because of some of the factors that I presented below earlier, that sometimes services are not seem to match. They don't seem to match. They're not attractive. And when something is not attractive, we often decide that we just don't need it, right? That we're not going to go through that type of work. You notice a smaller sliver, right? Almost 5% of folks that do feel like they should receive treatment, but they don't seek treatment. And again, that's a different type of barrier. But you see the problem here, right? This graph really brings home the urgency, right, of us using things like motivational interviewing, right, to help people understand the need for treatment and get motivated, but also to provide culturally centered and adapted services that are attractive, yeah? So adaptations are clearly important, but before we talk about adaptations, we have to ask, what is it that's being adapted, right? Because we have to start with something before we adapt it. And in the scientific community, we talk about evidence-based programs and practices. Sometimes they're called evidence-based treatments, right? EBPPs or EBTs. And they are, because of their research, the body of research behind them, they are the gold standard, right, for behavioral interventions. They have tended to be rigorously tested. We know that they work, we know how they work, and we know with whom they work, right, for what kinds of presenting problems. And although there are some folks that are not crazy about evidence-based programs because they feel like they're very rigid, I argue that it makes sense for us to use the most effective treatments for our loved ones and for our populations, right? We would never give a medication to someone or ask a family member to go through a medical procedure if we didn't know that it was worth the risks, if we didn't know the side effects, right? And so why isn't that true for the treatment of substance use and co-occurring disorders? There is a challenge, however, that we need to acknowledge, and that is that a lot of evidence-based programs and practices were not developed for Latino populations, and they have not been adapted, right? And so on many occasions, we are left with this issue of, do we use something that has been tested and researched, but that we feel in our bones is not connecting, right, to the populations we want to serve. And for that reason, treatment organizations are confronted with this challenge, right? What do we do in order to serve our populations well when we have these two conflicting things happen? So adaptation starts with the idea that we have an evidence-based program, right? And that we make the adaptations necessary so that they are able to meet the concerns and stressors of the Latino population, and to ensure that their way of working, right, is consistent with concepts, language, values, right, that Latino youth and families hold. And the hope of doing this, right, is that we're going to get better engagement, retention, outcomes, because the services are attractive and relevant, right, to Latino populations. For a while, there were a lot of questions about whether this was all worth it, you know? It's a lot of work to create adaptations of evidence-based treatments. And the question was whether it was worth it. And it's been nice to see more and more emerging evidence that when services are attractive, relevant, and useful to Latinos, their outcomes are better, right? The research has actually tested adapted and non-adapted services, and adapted services work much better in terms of engagement, retention, and outcomes. We have to throw a shout out to our colleague, Dr. Guillermo Bernal, who we lost a little bit ago, a huge figure in the field that made so many contributions to this area of work. And he talked about making treatments ecologically valid, right? Not only empirically validated, but also ecologically validated, consistent with the ecology of the folks we want to serve. So what are some of the ideas, right, that we can talk about that are relevant to cultures, right, and that have an influence? So for example, there are cultural notions about well-being and distress, right? How do we define, symptoms and problems so that we understand whether we should seek help? What is the problem? And what would it mean, right, to get better and to be healed? Cultural values, worldviews, practices are important, not just about the client, right? But we have to acknowledge that the therapist has cultural views, values, and practices. And the therapy, the model of therapy, also has values, assumptions within them, right? And so we always have to question whether that fit is the right one, right? In the book that we just published, and it was a fun opportunity to explain all of this in depth, we talk about, for example, the fact that for a long time, Latino families were said to be enmeshed, right? They were not launching their kids soon enough. We kept them home until, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And that was almost like, considered sort of a pathology, enmeshment, not launching kids. And the danger was that became part of the therapeutic assumption, right? The therapy models assumed that was the correct way to go. Now, interestingly, when you look at, and nobody questioned that, right? Nobody said, oh, is that assumption within the therapy models valid for all cultures? So it's interesting now, right? When it's so hard to get a home, when it's so hard to rent a home because of the prices, that all of a sudden, general culture, right? Generic culture is saying, well, maybe it's okay to have our kids at home later. maybe now we call them emerging adults. And now we actually have a terminology for it, right? Emerging adults. And what emerging adults does is it gives kids a space of, age 19, 20, 21 to still be, developing and emerging and making decisions as adults. But it's interesting, isn't it, that when the main culture, right, when the when the majority culture, the dominant culture makes a decision that there is such a thing as emerging adult, now it's not pathological. And now that might be built into therapies. So to me, that is an example of how we need to be careful, right? That to understand and to acknowledge that even our therapeutic approaches have cultural assumptions within them, right? And that we need to be very careful not to look down upon or to pathologize the cultural patterns, right, of folks we work with. I hope that makes sense. And maybe later you all can give me some examples of similar things. So the psychotherapy space, right, the therapeutic room has cultural values, practices from the client, from the therapist, from the therapy model, right? And lining these up, right, is very, very important, as Sue and others have talked about. So actually, maybe we could throw up a poll here really quickly because we had a question about whether any of the particular things that we're going to include in our poll were part of something that you had seen in therapy. And so let's see if we can insert that poll about cultural values. Don't see it coming up, so. I'll just state some of the things, right? For example, familism. Is that something that is a value and that impacts family, right? Okay, so here I see the poll here. So let's say I'm going to read it. We're not always aware of the types of beliefs, rituals, and behaviors that have roots in our culture and that impact therapy, right? Do any of these seem particularly powerful to you in terms of their implications for therapy, right? And we have it, I think we can have it in both English and Spanish, depending on your perspective. But what are some things? The view of family, right? Familism. What is acceptable behavior in children, right? There used to be a saying, in English, it's children are to be heard and to be seen and not heard. In Spanish, it's a much more graphic statement that I'll talk about later. But perspectives on mental health, egalitarianism versus traditionalism, right? Whether couples, whether family members should be of equal power, more or less, very democratic, or more hierarchical, right? Some people are in charge and some people are supposed to follow, right? So all of these things. So we'll take a look, respeto, respect, and gender roles, right? And so you can click all that apply that you think might be important, right, in terms of our work. When we get just about 50%, we'll stop. But I see numbers still coming in. 3, 2, 1. Let's take it off and see what the results are. So 85% feel that familism, right? La visión de la familia is very important. And that's absolutely true, isn't it? And sometimes it's a protective factor. And sometimes, this is hard to say, but sometimes it can become a risk factor if a youth, for example, is very unique and very different than what we expected. Youth can feel ostracized or separated out by the family because they're not conforming. And so it becomes a very interesting piece to follow. Yeah. 64% said view of children what's acceptable. 76% said the view of mental health. 30% on the egalitarianism and traditionalism. Hierarchy, 36%. Respeto, 64%. Yep. And 55% gender. I'm gonna tell you that the hierarchy one, which is one of the lowest, was one of the things that triggered my interest in doing this kind of work because family therapy encourages people to say what's on their mind and to, and to tell the rest of the family what they like and don't like about each other. And at one point I said, I wonder how my father, who was very traditional and hierarchical, would have done in that therapy. He would not have been there for more than one session because the expectation was more hierarchical. And it made me realize that a therapeutic value that was built on sort of egalitarianism, everybody gets to speak their mind, was not going to fit in a very traditional hierarchical family. And we, as therapists, would need to be aware of it, right? So I hope this triggered some thinking, some stimulated some thinking, and maybe it'll merge in the comments and in the questions that come up. Each of these, right? Each of these has the potential to be a lack of fit. If the families have one perspective and the therapy model and therapists have a different perspective, it can be a lack of fit when we try to move forward. Yeah. At some point in a little bit, we're going to stop and have some questions, and it'll be a great time for us to have some discussion on this. Now, I made the case of why cultural adaptation is a really helpful thing, right? Why do we want to line up with values and cultures? But it's not all that easy, is it? It is challenging. The first reason it's challenging is that there is no one size that fits all Latinos, right? You can get a sense of what kind of values and worldviews are common or are prominent in Latinos, familism, religiosity. But when you have a family in front of you, you cannot assume that, right? You cannot immediately start talking about the importance of religiosity because for that family, maybe that's not, right, a part of their core values. So you must have that in the back of your mind, have that knowledge, but then humbly explore, right, with the family. We also have to be careful not to weaken the impact of the evidence-based treatment. And that's often called the lack of fidelity, right? When you interrupt the fidelity of the treatment, the power of the treatment. So I wanted to give an example here. So imagine that we have a very effective pill, right? A medicine that the ingredient is very effective. It's very good at modifying the symptom that you have. But the minute that you put it in your mouth, it dissolves really quickly. It gives you that sour, cakey feel in your mouth. You probably are not going to take it, right? It's almost like not engaging in treatment because the immediacy of it tells you, I don't want this. I don't care how good it is. I'm not going to take it. So that would keep people from taking the pill. Suppose some really smart person said, I can add a hard shell to it, almost like an M&M, and you're gonna love it, and there's not gonna be any bad taste in your mouth, and you're gonna swallow it really easily. That's almost like making a cultural adaptation, right? I'm doing something that makes it easier for it to be your preference, right? It matches your preference for something that's not tart and cakey. But what happens if that shell that we put on that medicine is so hard that it doesn't dissolve quickly in your stomach, and you actually, it goes through your stomach, through your whole body, right? And you never get the active ingredients, right, of that medicine because it's way down there in that hard shell. This is, in effect, what we worry about with cultural adaptations, that somehow the things that we do to it to make it more valid, attractive, relevant, we worry whether that interferes with the main ingredients of the treatment. Yeah. So in program language, we worry whether adaptations might lead to a deviation, right, from the treatment manual uh, that leads to poor fidelity and poor outcomes. Yeah. We improved the fit to the preferences of the community, but we lost what was effective. Yeah. And this is a very important piece, that we not lose the core treatment components and ingredients. The preference and the mechanism of change need to work together in good balance. Yeah. Hope that piece makes sense. So we go back to cultural adaptations. Well, what does culture mean, right? What do we mean by culture? Well, knowledge, systems, concepts, values, beliefs, norms, practices, all of these things can be considered cultural components, right? Things that we might say, we want to tap into that to make our treatment a little more ecologically valid. Yeah. Culture, of course, is not stagnant. It's not static. It's always changing, right? It's always changing. The idea of acculturation, right? The idea of acculturation, that someone might actually begin to integrate, right? Even replace, right? Some Latino values with new values, and underlines the fact that not all Latinos are fit one model, right? No one model fits all Latinos, because two people can be Latino, one highly acculturated, one low acculturation, and they're very different, right, in their endorsement of Latino values. Again, Bernal and colleagues have talked about this issue of cultural adaptations as systematic, right? Systematic changes, not off the cuff, not, in the moment, like idiosyncratic, but systematic changes to existing treatment processes and protocols to incorporate values, beliefs, and assumptions. Yeah. By the way, I've argued in many places in the book and in a lot of articles that it's sort of unfair to a therapist, right, to say, here's the evidence-based model. It doesn't say anything about cultura. It says nothing about culture and worldviews. And it's your job to make it culturally centered and culturally adapted. It's your job, right? Based on your own training and cultural competence, it's now your job. But by the way, if I feel like you've modified it too much, you might be blamed for poor fidelity and poor adherence to the model. See, that's why I think that it's unfair for a therapist to be given that job, right? And that's why I think the systematic adaptations or the systematic development of a treatment for Latinos is so critically important. Yeah. So here's an interesting graphic. I'm not gonna get too much into the weeds here, but the idea is that on the left you see sort of cultural competence, right? Knowing certain things, knowing about backgrounds and cultures, knowing about values, right? But the problem there is that you are never going to be 100% culturally competent, right? Because at some point you're going to feel like you know everything and you know what is true for that family in front of you, and that's impossible, as I argued before. In fact, even within one family, within the family in front of you, you're going to have multiple people, probably with multiple and maybe even discrepant values. So of course you can't know everything that's true for that family. The discrepancies are the beauty, right? That's our material for work, for helping family. On the right side, you have cultural humility, right? The idea that you're curious, that you don't feel like you know everything, that you approach this with a humble, a humble nature and with curiosity and empathy. And so somewhere in the middle, when you bring these two things together, knowledge about the culture, knowledge about what might be humility and curiosity, right? And empathy, that's when you go there to the middle, that's the nice work that one can do, right? So I'm going to stop for a second here. It's a great time to um, consider some questions. I'm going to open the chat up and see if there's anything. But also, I welcome help from the team if there's anything that stands out for you as questions that we should address in this part of it, and then we'll move on to the second part. No questions yet? Comments? You can put them in the chat.
Not at the moment. Give it a couple of more minutes.
Okay. So I hope this piece makes sense about the lining up, right, of the values and the processes of treatment. Yeah.
We have a question. Can you address the issue of hierarchy a bit more?
Yeah, yeah. I'll tell you where I'm going to start with where it becomes really controversial, right? Just because I'm a controversial kind of guy. If you're doing marital therapy, if you're doing couples therapy, right? And you as a therapist can come in with an idea that, relationships should be egalitarian. Power should be equally distributed. Yeah. People should respect each other's power. They should consider, talk about, consider each other's perspectives, etc. And so many therapists come in with a framework, a blueprint, right, that should be egalitarian. What happens when you run into a couple that's very, very traditional and they actually have one person in charge and one person that's expected to follow in the couple, right? And that's their worldview, and they don't come in with a desire to change that. Yeah. The therapist has to be aware, right, that there is a need to respect where folks are coming from, right? Meet them where they're at, even as we might be able to say, hey, you know what, this approach that you're taking that's very hierarchical and not egalitarian gets you into trouble sometimes when this and this happens, right? When your partner feels disrespected and their views are not considered, and you make all the decisions in your household, and your partner is a little depressed, and far be it for me to challenge your value of power. However, since I know you don't want your partner to be depressed, I wonder if we need to talk about that. You see, that's an example of where we need to be careful not to impose our value, but to be sensitive and to be able to show whether there is a link between their current status and their symptoms. In families, some parents are very, very hierarchical. Children are supposed to be submissive and under the control of the parents and um, align with the values and perspectives of the parents, whether it be religiosity, whether it be about sexual orientation, whatever that is. And so that hierarchy can lead to major issues, right, in families. But we can't go in and impose egalitarianism. And so we have to be sensitive to what the values of the family are, and yet show, hey, maybe if you tweak this a little bit, your child is going to be uh, happier and more effective in your family. Yeah. So as I said, one of the things in family therapy that we often used to say is, well, everybody come in and everybody talk about what you like and dislike about the family. A very hierarchical traditional father may not be on board with that, you know? Why are you encouraging my son to be disrespectful to me by telling us all things that they don't like about me? That's a lack of fit, right? And we have to be sensitive to those things. That's, to me, hierarchy versus egalitarianism. Yeah. How
We
does a
have,
hierarchy issue get addressed in the
mhm.
context of siblings? That's another thing, right? A very traditional perspective might actually have very different gender roles, right? And again, we have to start helping the family to consider the possibility, yeah, that the rigidity of those gender roles are causing some difficulties in the family. And would they at least consider, exploring that question? Yeah. Was there a hand up?
No, doctor, sorry. It was just me. I was gonna read you the next question, but you already did, so
Okay,
we're good.
fantastic.
Thank you.
So I hope that those make sense. Religiosity, right? We're doing some really interesting things because religiosity, like familism, can be a real strength of the family. Yeah. And in fact, therapists who are not, I've been doing some writing on what do we do if the therapist is not religious and might tend to ignore, right, or circumvent a discussion of faith. But if that's what's important in the family, how can we not open that door up for discussion, right? It's not like we're imposing something, but we want to hear what the family's protective strength is, yeah? Now, when can that become a problem? When we work with kids that are presenting to their families a sexual orientation question, right? And sometimes the family says that their religious background does not allow for acceptance of that, and it becomes for a short period a risk factor, yeah, because there might be more rejection. And so a full discussion of that is important, and we need to be prepared and open, right, to have that discussion. In some ways, it's similar to when clients bring in issues of racism. There's a lot of literature on the fact that we as therapists know that racism is not a good thing, but sometimes we're not prepared, we're not trained to have that discussion comfortably, right? And even to say, you and I are of different races, how does that feel? How do you think that impacts our work? Do you worry about that? And so we need to be really prepared and trained to do that. When we do training of therapists, we try to concentrate on a number of those things that are difficult. Yeah.
We can continue, Dr. Santisteban. We can
Perfect.
have a space for more questions later on, if you think that's okay.
Okay, so now we've talked about why cultural adaptation, we've talked about challenges, right? Values. Now the question is, if we do decide to take on this systematic, right, this systematic process of adaptation, what might it look like, right? And there are a number of models and frameworks for doing this work. Two models stand out, and I know that there's a very nice document that the Center of Excellence has put out on making programs that work, and these two are emphasized. I commented on ecological validity a second ago, Guillermo Bernal, and we also have the cultural sensitivity framework. And so let's talk a little bit about this cultural validity model, yeah? And this slide actually restates something that I said earlier, that there are studies, right? There is emerging research that shows that the level of adaptation, the degree of adaptation in a model can be directly linked to the outcomes of that work, yeah? So if you see the work by Soto and others have also done similar work. The trials have reported that a more complete set of adaptations, right, led to a more effective set of programs, right, compared to programs with fewer adaptations. What does that mean? That means that if I put some pictures up of people that are similar to the look of the population that I serve, or I put artifacts, right, decorations up, that might be nice, right? That might be very important. But if I compare only that to programs that are at their root, at their core adapted, well, the ones that have the deeper adaptations are going to likely lead to better outcomes, yeah? Doesn't mean that the first one the decorations isn't helpful, but it means that we can do adaptations at many levels, yeah? And the beautiful thing about this model of culture of ecological validity is that it actually lays out, right, many of the areas, many of the levels at which we can create adaptations, right? Do any models like cover all of these areas? Likely not. But you might, in attempting to culturally adapt some evidence-based intervention, might choose which of these are particularly important, yeah? So let's talk about a couple of them. Language, right? Does the client understand the language, idioms, and words used? That's our very first challenge, right? Some folks that I'm trying to train folks across the country on our culturally informed family therapy model. And the first thing they say is, well, our therapists don't speak the language of the client, right? And we have to have interpreters. Well, that's a big challenge, isn't it? Interpreters are better than not having interpreters, but we have to be very aware of the fact that all the complications that brings, yeah? At the very basic thing, at the very basic level, clients that understand the language of the therapist is helpful. Is the patient comfortable with the similarity or difference in the ethnicity of the therapist? So that's the matching or not matching, right? And I would argue that ends up being important. However, when a therapist is not matched, but is able to have a discussion, an in-depth discussion of any concerns that brings up, that can dampen, right, the negative effect of having difference, yeah? And by the way, matching sometimes is really good, matching on ethnicity, on race, but there's also a flip side. Sometimes when you're matched, you think that you know your client 100%, and that ain't the case, right? That's just not the case. You still have to be humble. You still have to be curious, right? You have more information, right, in your bag of tricks, in your toolbox, but you still have to be humble enough to not assume and to ask the right questions, yeah? Metaphors. What is that idea of, dichos, right? Common and ethnic group that can be part of an intervention. Well, in our work with adolescents and families, right, one of the most common dichos is dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres, right? depending on who you're hanging out with, who you're spending time with, I can tell who you're going to be and who you are because peers influence, right? Context, relational context determines or contributes to, right, your actions and behaviors. So, dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres is a very powerful, saying and metaphor in our work with Latino families. Yeah. Things like, does the therapist understand the client in terms of things like familism, respeto, respect, personalismo, gender roles, right? And that's why, if you can build in some of these things into the evidence-based treatment that did not have those things in it, you can, as you train your therapist, prepare them, right? To connect around some of these issues. Yeah. And let's be honest again, a lot of the old time therapies, they were like very individually focused. You got to do what's right for you, right? You got to do what's right for you. And there's something helpful about that, right? Individuation and, attending to your own needs. But familism is not that always. Sometimes you do things for the well-being of families, and that's okay and that's powerful. And you shouldn't try to, impose an individualistic perspective on folks that, I would make that change in my behavior for the well-being of my family, right? And their reputation. And if that's their view, why mess with it? Yeah. One of the reasons that I like motivational interviewing, motivation enhancement as a therapy, as an intervention, is because it actually explores what is the motivating factor in your client without imposing anything, right? I always remember that I had an adolescent who was getting into major, major trouble, arrests, hospitalizations. And at some point, when we brought in the younger sibling and we said, what does it mean to you that your younger sibling is sort of learning from that behavior? And that adolescent actually decided to make major changes in his life because he decided he didn't want to do that to his younger sibling. Yeah. Who are we to decide that that's not the right motivation? That was his motivation, and it was powerful. Yeah. Within concepts, this issue of is the patient in agreement with the definition of the problem and the specific treatment, right? When we say that therapeutic alliance is really important and really powerful in terms of determining outcomes, these are major components of what therapeutic alliance is. Yeah. Does the client feel understood by the therapist? Does the client agree with what the therapist is formulating as the problem? And does the client agree with the therapist formulation of the solution? Yeah. Too often we say, our therapy is this, right? Our theory of change is this, and let's go. And sometimes it's good to stop and just bring the clients along with us, yeah, in a shared decision-making kind of way, you know. You told me that, that you have a problem with explosiveness and that and impulsivity, and that it gets you into trouble. If we found psychoeducational material, if we found some stuff that would help you with that, would you want to do that? Would you be cool about doing that? The minute that they say yes, because I told you that was a problem and you're telling me that this would line up with it, the minute that that person says, yeah, that makes sense, it's a shared decision-making way of moving forward. Yeah. A collaborative way of moving forward versus a therapist seeming to impose their therapy model on them. And then we see goals here, therapeutic goals consistent with cultural expectations. Do they agree? These are very similar, right? The concepts and the goals are very similar here. But these are all levels, right? And they get deeper and deeper in terms of the way the therapy is going to work and ensuring that it lines up, right, with the expectations and values of the family. Yeah. Methods are the treatment methods framed, right, in a way that clients agree with them. Methods are things like, are you going to tackle cognitions? Are we going to tackle trauma, previous traumatic experiences? Are we going to bring in the family? Is this primarily family therapy? Is it individual therapy? Um, it's helpful to get into some level of agreement, right? And to have a discussion, shared decision making, right? About the methods that we're going to use. And it's incumbent upon us, it's our responsibility to be able to explain why we would recommend approaching a problem in a particular way, right? I'm a strong proponent of family therapy, a strong proponent of family therapy. But when I train my therapists, I tell them it's your job to explain to the family why you think family therapy is going to be helpful, right? Our clients did not go to a family therapy class. They didn't hear the logic of a family therapy. If they say, my kid's the one that's getting into trouble with the police and at school, and I'm going to drop him off to you, and, he's the one with the problem, that sort of makes some logical sense to me. So it's my job, if I think that no, bringing in the family is going to make a big difference because I'm going to be able to trigger or mobilize the healing power of La Familia, I have to make that case to the family. Yeah. Rather than have the expectation that, well, of course they should just follow my directives. Yeah. Very different, right? One is collaborative, one is sort of imposing things. Yeah. If people drop out when we're imposing things, we shouldn't be surprised. Yeah. This last one, really critical. Are any of our families going through any of these issues? Migration, acculturation, adaptation stress, relationship issues that occur because of separations during immigration, all these kinds of things, right? Economic difficulties. I work quite a bit with families that get reunited after they immigrated separately, and that's just a very powerful time where they're trying to come together again and to process hurts, right? Why did you leave me behind? Do you have any idea how lonely I was back in my, country of origin? These are things that if they are prominent and common in the families we work with, our therapy model must be prepared, right, to address those things. It can't be done on the fly, right? And so in the example of the family therapy that we developed, we have lots of material just around this because we think that it is the way to mobilize family healing to address some of these stressors. If a therapist is not knowledgeable enough about any of these things, what they're going to do is that they're going to avoid asking about it. And even if they hear a little something on, that immigration was really hard, that adaptation to culture was really hard, the therapist is not prepared mentally, they're not grounded in that, they will just go right by it and miss the fact that that is one of the core issues in that family in front of you. Yeah? So I hope that makes sense, that you can see that as you move down in levels of adaptation, right? Goes right back to the finding by Soto, right? That the more deep the more deep the level of adaptation, the more likely it's going to enhance the outcomes of the program. Okay? And the work from the cultural sensitivity framework is sort of similar, right? They have two categories that I found very helpful, and it's superficial adaptation. And I talked about some of those, right? You can have material on food and music, and do you like to dance salsa, or do you like to do the moonwalk? Um, I like to do both, of course. But yeah, those could be considered superficial, right? Topics and adaptations. But deep adaptations, right? The ones that really get at the unique stressors, right, of the community and the unique way in which your model that you've selected, whatever that is, CBT, trauma-focused CBT, dialectic behavior therapy, family systems, whatever that is. And once you understand how that model works and its mechanisms, then you have to incorporate the deep adaptations at that level so that they're working together. Mechanisms and adaptation, right? In our pill example earlier, ingredients that reach your system and get digested to help you with your symptom, but also a coating that makes it palatable, right? They have to work together. Here's another meta-analysis, that's Escobar and et al., and talks about again that the deeper the adaptations, the better the outcomes. Yeah. And again, I want to reiterate that these research studies, Soto, Escobar, were critically important because this is hard work. This is not done easily. Yeah. Takes some resources to do this. Takes some good partners to do this. Yeah. And is it worth it? And when we look at studies that show outcomes are better, our kids are getting better, our familias are getting better, now it's worth it. Yeah. So I thought I'd give you just, an example of what we work on, what I work on, which is culturally informed, flexible treatment for adolescents. And it's a culturally centered family therapy model. This is the one that had the book that came out with Guilford Press this year. And it has a lot of components. It's a multi-component therapy. And I'm going to tell you why we picked some of these, right? So we integrated motivational interviewing for the youth. Why is that? Because it allows the clients to find their own unique reasons, right, that motivate them to do the work of changing. Yeah. It's a lot easier to say, no big deal. The cops are just picking on me. There is racism in the school. That's why I was identified. Um, this drug use is not that big a deal. All of those things may be true, by the way, of many of them. Racism might be there for sure. Um, Selection, identification of certain types of individuals can be true for sure. But still, we want the kids to think about, okay, do you want anything to change? And why would you want to change? Rather than us imposing, you should do this, you should stop drug use, you should stop, whatever that is, which kids are used to fighting, right? They're used to confronting authority figures that always tell them to stop. If we're just one more authority figure telling them that they need to stop, we're not very different. But if we can stop and say, what's your perspective on whether you're getting better or not? What's your perspective on your trajectory, which looks like it's going into jail, What's your perspective on that, and is that what you want? Or would you consider doing something different? Yeah. And if you want to do something different, I'm here to help. Motivational interviewing, very powerful. Yeah. And like I said before, it allows the client to bring in their own cultural reasons, right? Religiosity, familism, respeto, whatever that might be. Yeah. It's a family therapy, right? So we work hard on using family mechanisms that we know are important. What are they? Communication, repairing ruptured relationships, helping parents be better leaders, right? Mobilizing the familism that is so healing. So those are our mechanisms. And we want to mobilize those to address the unique stressors of Latino families. Ones that we talked about already: immigration stress, acculturation stress, economic stress, right? All those kinds of things that are so, so important. Yeah? Coming together, unique stressors of the Latino family, unique ones that we're prepared to think about and talk about with the therapeutic mechanisms and to think about how they work together. Yeah. We're also aware of the parts, right? And I talked about these a little bit before. Parts of family therapy that can, in some way, be difficult, that can violate assumptions or values, right? Of traditional families. Challenging that violates respeto. Egalitarian perspectives that clash with traditionalism, right? So those are all important to consider. And we build that right into the therapy. Then finally, we have individual work with the kids. We have family therapy that's focused on a lot of the stressors that occur in Latino families. Then finally, we have psychoeducational material. Why, right? Psychoeducational material is helpful in general because it sets the tone, provides information, provides a framework, right, for families to think about things. But in Latino families, right, there could be unique things, right, that they are struggling with. Our Latino families, when they were in our substance use program, they said, I know a lot about alcohol. I don't know a lot about these other things. And I feel foolish trying to have a conversation with my kids because they laugh that I don't know anything about marijuana or any other, Adderall that they're taking, whatever it is that they're taking. So we realized that if we can do a psychoeducational with the parents around substance use, they were now more confident, right, in their conversation with their kids, and they can more readily become leaders. See, up here I said leadership is important, right? We want to promote leadership, but we realized that in order for them to feel confident as leaders, we needed to give them some information, right? We do parenting modules. We do substance use. We do things on sexuality, right? Our Latino families in a study said, I know that I should be talking to my kids about sexuality and safe sex, but they laugh at me because they say I don't know anything about anything because nobody had that talk with me. So we created a psychoeducational module just around that to give them words and language and knowledge so that they can feel more confident, right, in their leadership of their kids around this issue. We do the same with self-harm, social media, the legal system, right? But you see that all these pieces are now designed to be working in synergy. Yeah. We give things that are unique to Latinos, but always thinking about how that improves the mechanisms, right, of work. Yeah. This therapy was less of an adapted treatment. That is, we didn't, although you can think about it multiple ways because systems family therapy exists, right? Without any focus on culture, right? So in a way, it's an adaptation of family systems theory, but it was really developed from the ground up from, decades of work with Latino families, and their voices were really built into the material. Yeah. And with that, we get to the end. I'm going to open up my chat. Any questions
Perfect.
that come up?
Yes, we have a couple more questions. Let me see. There's an adapted cultural adaptation questionnaire that Mario will be sharing, as I can see in the chat.
Beautiful.
Um, Okay, we have a question. What techniques help maintain emotional connection when communication must flow through an interpreter?
Yeah, the interpreter, I'm telling you, there are very few, you need someone to monitor the interpreter, right? To make sure that they're really conveying not only ideas and words, but emotions, right? And it's a challenge. I wish that I had something really unique to tell you on the work of interpreters, but I just find that it's very, very difficult when you're trying to convey not just ideas but feelings, right? Because that's the thing, it's and sometimes you might even have to ask the interpreter, are you just giving me the concept, the thing that they say, or can you ask them how they feel about it, right? Because you might even have to do extra work to make sure that you're capturing the pain, the hopelessness, right? That's being experienced by the client. Yeah. It can't just be the concept. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer, Dr. Daniel. We have another question. Do you have any suggestions when religious values are protective versus when they may create barriers to treatment and communication?
Yeah. Well, so I'll tell you, we had a study on self-harm, right? We wanted to help kids that were self-harming and suicidal. And we created this program, right, for that. And all of a sudden, we realized that a lot of the kids that were coming were gay and lesbian youth, right? And it wasn't that we went out of our way to recruit that population, but they were dealing with self-harm to such a high degree that they were very prominent in our population. And so, as we asked questions and as we explored what was happening in the family, we realized that many of the families had a religious faith background. Yeah. And typically, that faith background was their rock, right? It was their support around many issues. But when the parents now were dealing with a sexual orientation question in their kids, the parents felt more shame, right? They didn't feel like they can go to their faith community, right? And it was more of a shame that the family experienced versus a help. Does that make sense? If the problem had been a different one, they would have leaned on their faith community. Yeah. And so we found it a unique moment where, and we had parents, right, that would tell us that story because we depend on the voices of parents. And they would tell us, I not only am not going to my church family, my faith community, but I'm actually hiding from them because now I would have to tell them why my kids are struggling, right? Does that happen in all families? Of course not, right? Does the faith community help many families? Of course they do, even in that situation. But we found some unique sort of places, right, where that became more of a stress for a little while than a protective factor. The same thing happens with familism, by the way. If the child deviates too far from what's expected in the family, right? What's the expectation? And if the familism is somewhat inflexible, then the child can feel pushed away, like not included in the family. And all of a sudden, familism, which is such a beautiful protective factor, can actually start becoming a little bit of a stressor. And that's where we have to come in to repair that process. Yeah. Hope that makes sense. I see a comment here. You must be careful of familiarity if you are matched with your client. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's what Mercedes meant here. That if you're matched, all of a sudden you think that right? That you're very familiar with, and you might start assuming things versus exploring things. Yeah. And that's a difficult place to be. Yeah. Any other questions that I missed? Let's see. Anything else that stands out for folks? Some questions? Let's see.
I'm looking through the chat. I believe we have all the questions answered. If you have any more questions, be happy to use the chat. We have a couple minutes, so we have time to answer any more. I'm going to leave on screen, Dr. Daniel, the evaluation form so that you have the time as well to fill it out, as well as a friendly reminder to also fill out the evaluation environmental scan form when you have a chance. Thank you. And then I'll be on the lookout through the chat if we have any more questions.
And when it says adds, the patient may also not address issues in a therapeutic manner,
Mm-hmm.
rather based on the familiarity. Absolutely correct. Yeah. Sorry, the screen may have moved when I removed something, so if you want to move it back.
No worries. No worries. I got it under control. No worries.
And I want to say thank you again to the Center of Excellence. You all do such amazing work and address such critical topics for the well-being of our community. So thank you. I say
Thank you, Doctor. Mm-hmm.
gracias to you and gracias to all the therapists that and the counselors that are doing such important work. We appreciate you.
We appreciate you as well for being here and taking the time to present this wonderful presentation. We hope to keep working with you in the near future. Thank you all for being here today. We have a couple more minutes so you can take the time to fill out the evaluation form and the environmental scan. Thank you so much. We'll keep it up for a couple more minutes and then we'll end the webinar. Yes, the presentation was sent via chat in a PDF form. It was also resent right now, and it will also be in our platforms. When you fill out the evaluation form, please feel free to add in the comments what webinars, the topics of future webinars would you like, okay? That would help us a lot in getting webinars in the topics that you are interested in. Okay, thank you all for being here once again. Dr. Daniel, muchas gracias. Thank you for being here and taking the time for this valuable information. We'll be closing the webinar now.